The moment Hector Grimes saw the stagecoach roll into Dry Creek Ridge, he didn't step aside. He stepped forward. He planted himself right in the middle of Main Street, thumbs hooked in his belt, and laughed, loud enough for every soul on that boardwalk to hear. "Well, I'll be damned," he called out, loud and slow, the way a man talks when he knows everyone's listening. Thorne Calloway actually went and ordered himself a wife, like you order a mule from a catalog. He turned to the crowd gathering on both sides of the street. "Let's see what kind of desperate woman shows up for that face." The laughter spread like wildfire through dry grass. Nobody stopped it. If this story already has your heart pounding, hit subscribe, drop a like, and tell me in the comments what city or country you're watching from. Let's see how far this story travels. Now, let's go back to where it all began. The letter had taken 11 days to reach Marlo Winslow. She'd read it 4 times before she let herself believe it was real. Not because the handwriting was elegant, it wasn't. The letters pressed hard into the paper, like the man writing them was fighting the pen the whole time. Some words were crossed out. One entire sentence had been scratched over so completely she couldn't make it out, no matter how she tilted the paper toward the window light. But that didn't bother her. What got her? What made her sit down on the edge of her cot and press the letter against her sternum like she was trying to feel the words through her ribs? Was a single paragraph near the middle of the page. "I am not going to pretend I am something I am not. Half my face was burned in a mine explosion 7 years ago. People in this town cross the street when they see me coming. I don't blame them anymore. I am telling you this now so you are not surprised when you arrive, if you choose to come. I would rather you know the truth and say no than make the journey and feel deceived." She read that part again. "I would rather you know the truth and say no." In 31 years of living, Marlo Winslow had never once had a man offer her the choice to say no before he decided he didn't want her. She wrote back the same night. She didn't tell her sister where she was going at first. That was a mistake. Clara found the draft of the response letter on the kitchen table 3 days later and came into the bedroom where Marlo was stitching the hem of her travel skirt. "You're not seriously considering this?" Marlo didn't look up. "I've already written back." "Marlo." Clara sat down on the bed. The mattress creaked. "A mail order arrangement to a man in where? Wyoming? Colorado." "Colorado." Clara said it like the word itself was offensive. "You don't know this man." "I know what he wrote." "Anyone can write anything." Marlo finally set the skirt down. She looked at her sister. Claire was 2 years younger and had been married 8 years to a perfectly decent man who'd never once made her feel like a burden. Clara meant well. That was the honest truth. But there were things Clara would never understand. Not really, and Marlo had stopped trying to explain them. "He told me about his scars before I asked," Marlo said quietly. "Before I could ask. He told me so I wouldn't be surprised." She paused. "Do you know how rare that is, Clara? For someone to just tell you the ugly truth about themselves and let you decide?" Clara was quiet for a moment. "He might be dangerous." "He might be." Marlo picked the skirt back up. "Most things worth doing carry some danger." She left on a Tuesday. The journey took 9 days by train and then 2 more by stagecoach over roads that had no business being called roads. By the time Dry Creek Ridge appeared at the base of a sloping valley, Marlo's back ached in places she hadn't known she had. The stage driver had been polite enough, said nothing about her size, just helped her bags down without comment, which she appreciated more than he'd ever know. She stepped off the coach and immediately felt every eye on Main Street swing toward her like weather vanes catching a sudden wind. She was used to being looked at. She'd been looked at her whole life. But this felt different, heavier, more intentional, like the looking had been anticipated, like people had come out specifically to see this. That's when she heard him. Hector Grimes was standing in front of Dolan's Feed and Goods, one shoulder propped against the post, a toothpick working slow in the corner of his mouth. He was maybe 45, barrel-chested, with a wide face that might have been handsome once if the years hadn't run roughshod over it. He had the look of a man who'd never been told no by anyone who could make it stick. He looked at Marlo, then he looked at the people gathered on the boardwalks on either side of Main Street. Then he opened his mouth. "Well, there she is," his voice carried. He made sure it did. "Lord Almighty, Thorne Calloway sent for a wife and they shipped him a whole county." The laughter came fast. Some people tried to smother it. You could see them pressing their lips together, but it broke through anyway. A couple of men near the saloon didn't even bother trying to hide it. Marlowe stopped walking. She didn't look away from Hector Grimes. She'd learned a long time ago that looking away just encouraged people, made them think they'd hit something soft enough to keep hitting. So she stood there on the rutted dirt of Main Street, bags at her feet, and she looked straight at him. Hector grinned wider. He hadn't expected that. He'd expected her to duck her head, maybe move faster, maybe cry. Women like that usually cried when you said it loud enough. The fact that she was just standing there threw him slightly, and so he pushed harder the way bullies always do when the first shot doesn't land. "What are you looking at, sweetheart?" "Go on." "Thorne's Forge is at the end of the street. Maybe between the two of you, you'll scare off enough folks to have some peace and quiet." He turned to the man next to him. "You think they ordered her from the same catalog as him? Or does she come from a different one? The large one?" More laughter. And then it stopped. Because from the far end of Main Street came the sound of boots on packed earth, slow and deliberate, and the crowd parted without being asked, the way crowds always part when something they fear is moving through them. Thorne Calloway was not a large man in the way the word usually means. He wasn't the biggest man in Dry Creek Ridge, but he had a kind of density to him, a concentrated solidity that made him seem larger than his measurements, as if the years at the forge had compressed him somehow, packed everything tighter. He wore no hat. His dark hair was pushed back from his forehead, and the left side of his face, the side that had been nearest the explosion, was a landscape of scar tissue, ridged and pale, pulling the corner of his eye down slightly, distorting the edge of his mouth. He walked straight toward Marlowe Winslow without looking at Hector Grimes at all. Not once. That, somehow, was worse than if he'd looked. He stopped in front of her. His good eye, the right one, brown and steady, moved over her face, not up and down, not the way people usually looked, but just at her face, like that was the only part that mattered. "Miss Winslow," he said. His voice was low and a little rough, like something that didn't get used as much as it should. "Mr. Calloway," she said. They looked at each other for a moment. Around them the street had gone quiet enough that you could hear the wind moving through the gap between Dolan's store and the milliner's next door. "You made it," he said. "I did. How was the road?" "Terrible," she said honestly. "I think I left pieces of my spine somewhere after the second ridge." Something shifted at the corner of his mouth, the unscarred side. It might have been the beginning of a smile. "That'd be Harker Pass. It does that. Someone should fix it. I've been saying that for 6 years. Nobody listens." Hector Grimes hadn't moved from his spot by the post. He seemed to be trying to decide whether what was happening was still funny or whether it had become something else. He cleared his throat, loud enough to reassert himself. "Touching reunion," he called out. "Real poetic. The beast and his beauty. Except in this version, neither of them's the beauty part." He grinned at his own joke. Thorne turned his head then, slow. He looked at Hector Grimes for a long moment, and whatever was in that look made two of the men standing near Hector take a small involuntary step backward. "Hector," Thorne said. "Just the name. Nothing else." Hector's grin stayed put, but something behind it shifted. "Just having a little fun, Calloway. No harm." "She just got off a 9-day journey." "Marty." Thorne held the look for another beat. "She doesn't need your fun today." He picked up Marlowe's bags before she could reach for them. Both of them, one in each hand, and turned back toward the far end of the street. "If you'll follow me," he said to Marlowe. "I've got coffee made. It's not great coffee, I'll warn you, but it's hot." She fell in beside him. Behind them, Hector Grimes said something else, something she didn't quite catch, and a few people laughed again, quieter this time. But she was already looking forward, and the laughter felt like it was coming from a very long distance away. The forge was at the end of a short side road off Main, set back from the other buildings with a small house attached to the far side of it. The whole setup was clean in a utilitarian way, not pretty, but not neglected either. The forge itself was banked low, the coals a dim orange in the afternoon light. The house had 2 windows facing the road and a front door that looked like it had been replaced more recently than everything else, the wood still pale compared to the weathered siding around it. Inside was sparse. A table, 2 chairs, a wood stove in the corner with a battered coffee pot sitting on top as promised, a shelf with a few books. She noted their spines without meaning to, couldn't help it, had always been that way. A doorway leading to what she assumed was a bedroom. One bedroom. She became aware of this fact in a different way than she had when it was only a logical abstraction of the arrangement. Thorne set her bags by the door. He poured coffee into 2 tin mugs without asking and set one on the table in front of her chair, and then he sat down in the other chair across from her and wrapped his hands around his own mug. He didn't pretend it wasn't strange. She appreciated that. "I've arranged for the Reverend to come day after tomorrow," he said, "if that's agreeable. That gives you time to rest and decide." Marlowe looked at him. "Decide? Whether you want to go through with it." He said it matter-of-factly, no wounded pride edging the words. "I meant what I wrote. You've got the right to decide you'd rather go back. I'll pay your passage either way." "You'd do that?" "Yes." "Why?" He seemed to think about that more carefully than she expected. "Because it's the right thing," he said finally, "and because I don't want someone in my house who doesn't want to be here. That doesn't work for either person." She wrapped her hands around the tin mug. The coffee was, as advertised, not great. It had been sitting too long, gone slightly bitter. She drank it anyway because the warmth was good. "I didn't come 9 days on bad roads to turn around," she said. "All right. I'm not going to pretend I know you yet," she continued, "and you don't know me. We could be terrible together. I might hate the way you leave things around. You might find me insufferable before the month's out." "Fair enough. But I'm not afraid of that." She met his eyes, his one steady brown eye and what the other side of his face had become. And she held his gaze the way she'd held Hector Grimes's gaze out in the street, because she'd decided a long time ago that looking away was something she was done with. "I'm not afraid of starting something that might be hard." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What are you afraid of?" She thought about it honestly. "Wasting time being small," she said. "Spending my life trying to take up less space than I actually take up. That frightens me more than anything you might turn out to be." Something moved across his face then, across the scarred side and the unscarred side both. Something that didn't quite have a name, but was something in the neighborhood of recognition. "Day after tomorrow, then," he said. "Day after tomorrow." She slept in the bedroom. He slept on a bedroll near the forge, said the warmth of the banked coals suited him, and she was fairly sure that was at least partly true, but also partly courtesy, and she appreciated both things without saying so. She lay in the dark for a while, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the place. The wind off whatever ridge gave the town its name, the distant sound of the saloon 2 streets over, something that might have been an owl. Different sounds than she'd fallen asleep to her whole life. Not worse, just different. She thought about the way Hector Grimes had looked at her on that street. She'd seen that look 1,000 times. The look that said, "You are not what a person should be, and I am allowed to say so." She'd spent 20 years trying to convince herself it didn't matter, trying to become small enough inside that the words couldn't find a target worth hitting. It had never quite worked. But she'd also seen the way Thorne Calloway had not looked at her, not the way everyone else had, not the inventory look, up and down, measuring and categorizing, just at her face. Like the rest of her was beside the point. She didn't know what to do with that yet. It was too new. She held it carefully, the way you hold something that might break. She fell asleep before she meant to. The next morning she was up before him. She found the kitchen supplies in a state that told her 2 things immediately. First, the man could survive on his own, and second, he was only surviving, not living. The larder had the basic necessities and exactly none of the extras. Cornmeal, salt pork, dried beans, some flour that was a little old, a half jar of molasses. She found eggs from what turned out to be 3 chickens kept in a small pen behind the house, a detail she discovered when she heard them and went to investigate. By the time he appeared in the kitchen doorway, she had eggs cooked, cornbread in the pan on the wood stove, and a second pot of coffee on that she'd started fresh. He stopped in the doorway. He'd clearly not expected this. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "I know. She handed him a plate. I wanted to. I needed something to do with my hands. He sat down. He ate, and she saw the way his eyes closed very briefly on the first bite. The involuntary response of someone who'd been eating purely for fuel for a long time and had just been reminded there was another way. He didn't make a big deal of it. She liked that. I need to open the forge this morning, he said after a while. Oswald Briggs is coming for a repaired axle fitting. You don't have to do anything. Just, the house is yours to move around in. Can I watch? He looked at her over his coffee mug. Watch what? The work. In the forge. I've never seen a blacksmith work. I'd like to know what the business actually is, if I'm going to be part of it. He seemed to consider whether that was an odd request. Then he decided it wasn't. All right, he said. Stay back from the coals, and don't touch the quench barrel. What's in the quench barrel? Water and oil. Very hot after I've been using it. You'll get burned. I won't touch it, she said. I don't touch things I've been told will burn me. Something at the corner of his mouth again. Good policy, he said. She washed the plates while he went to build the forge fire up, and she could hear the bellows working, the gradual rush of heat, the way the sound of it changed as the coals caught and climbed. She dried her hands on the cloth by the basin and followed the sound. She stood in the doorway of the forge and watched him work for an hour. She'd expected to find it interesting in an abstract way. She found it fascinating in a completely concrete way. The way he knew exactly how long to leave the metal in the fire, by some combination of its color and some instinct she couldn't see him apply but could see him using. The way the hammer came down, not randomly but with intention, each strike placed, each movement economical and exact. There was nothing wasted. He didn't perform the work. He just did it. And here, in the forge, his scarred face was just his face. It wasn't something to manage or look around. It was just the face of the man doing the work. When Oswald Briggs arrived for his axle fitting, he went stiff the moment he saw Marlowe standing in the doorway. His eyes did the inventory look. She saw it happen. This year, Briggs started. Miss Winslow, Thorne said without looking up from the fitting he was testing. She arrived yesterday. We marry tomorrow. Briggs opened his mouth, then he closed it. He looked at Marlowe. She looked back at him with the same steady patience she'd given Hector Grimes on Main Street, and something about that look appeared to give Oswald Briggs some trouble. He paid for his fitting. He said good morning in Marlowe's direction, not quite meeting her eyes. He left. Thorne watched him go. Then he looked at Marlowe. You've got a look, he said. Do I? Makes people uncomfortable. I know, she said. I worked on it. He made that not quite smile again, and this time it made it all the way to both sides of his face, the scarred side pulling differently than the other, but arriving at the same place. It was the first time she'd seen him smile. She thought, standing in the doorway of that forge with the heat coming off the coals and the smell of iron in the air, that it was probably not going to be the last. Quote, they married the following afternoon. The Reverend came as arranged, a thin man named Pruitt, who was clearly uncomfortable with the entire situation, but performed his duty without editorializing, which was all they'd asked of him. Hector Grimes had apparently spread the word, because there were at least 30 people watching from a distance, clustered on the far side of the street, craning to see through the open door of the small side office where Reverend Pruitt performed the simple ceremony. Marlowe was aware of them. She didn't look at them. She looked at Thorne. He was watching her with that steady brown eye, and whatever he was thinking she couldn't fully read, but she didn't think it was reluctance. She thought it might be something more like careful hope, the kind of hope that's been disappointed before and has learned to hold itself at arm's length just in case. She understood that. She was holding the same kind. Do you, Thorne Calloway? Reverend Pruitt said. Take this woman. I do, Thorne said. He didn't wait for the end of the sentence. Pruitt blinked. Marlowe almost smiled. And do you, Marlowe Winslow? I do, she said. Pruitt looked between them like he wasn't sure what to do with people who skipped the formality. Then by the authority, thank you, Reverend, Thorne said, and held out his hand for Marlowe. She took it. His hand was enormous and rough and warm from the forge, and it swallowed hers completely, and she felt the 30 people watching from across the street all hold their breath at once, waiting for something. Shock, disgust, performance of some kind. What they got was two people walking out of a side office together, hand in hand, heading back toward the end of the street. Hector Grimes was there again. Of course he was. "Well," he said, loud enough for the crowd. "The freak show's official now." Thorne stopped. Marlowe felt his hand tighten around hers, not in pain but in tension. The tension of a man deciding whether to let something go or not. She could feel the decision happening through his palm. She squeezed back. He looked at her. She looked at him. She gave the smallest shake of her head. Not don't, but not now. Not like this. Not for him. He held her eyes for a moment. Then he turned away from Hector Grimes and kept walking. And the crowd, who had come expecting a spectacle of misery, got something they had not planned for. Two people choosing each other, and choosing, deliberately, not to give the watchers the disaster they'd come to see. That, more than anything, seemed to unsettle Hector Grimes most of all. Behind them, his laughter came, but it came alone this time. Nobody joined it. The first week of marriage was mostly silence, but it wasn't the uncomfortable kind. It was the silence of two people who had both spent a long time living alone and hadn't yet worked out the rhythms of sharing space with another person. Who moved first in the morning? Who got the basin first? Whether the lamp stayed on past dark or got blown out early. Small things. The kind of small things that, in another context, would be trivial, but between two strangers who had just legally bound themselves to each other in front of a nervous reverend and a crowd of gawkers, carried a certain weight. Thorne was up before the sun every day without exception. She learned this on day 2, when she woke to the sound of the bellows already working and came into the kitchen to find coffee made and a plate of salt pork sitting on the back of the stove, covered with a cloth to keep it warm. He hadn't knocked, hadn't waited, had just made extra and left it there and gone to work. She stood in the kitchen in the early gray light and looked at that covered plate for a longer moment than was probably warranted. Then she sat down and ate it, and afterward she washed both their plates and restacked them on the shelf. And when he came in at mid-morning for water, she had bread cooling on the table from flour she'd found in the back of the larder. Neither of them said anything about any of it, but something was being negotiated, wordlessly, in the territory of covered plates and washed dishes and fresh bread. Something that felt, very tentatively, like the beginning of a system. By the end of the second week, Marlowe had started keeping the forge's books. It wasn't something she'd asked to do exactly. It had evolved more organically than that. She'd been watching him work. She kept doing that, kept finding herself in the doorway of the forge, unable to explain the pull of it, except that she found the work honest in a way she respected. And one afternoon she'd noticed the wooden box on the shelf by the door, the one he kept his receipts in. Or what passed for receipts. They were more like scraps. Half of them weren't dated. Some were just numbers scratched on the backs of other pieces of paper. "What's your system for this?" she asked him. He looked up from the piece he was working on. "What system?" "The box, the receipts." He shrugged one shoulder. "I keep what's paid, what's owed. I remember." She looked at the box. She looked at him. "You keep it in your head?" "I know what I'm owed." "Do you know what you should be owed versus what you've agreed to accept?" He set the piece down. "What do you mean?" She'd pulled out a handful of the scraps by then. She spread 3 of them on the workbench. "Oswald Briggs. You repaired an axle fitting and 2 barrel hoops. What did he pay?" Thorne told her. She looked at the scrap. "The fitting alone should have run twice that based on the iron cost and the labor time you described. Did he argue the price?" Thorne was quiet. "Did you give him a reduced rate without him asking?" "He's got 4 kids," Thorne said. "I understand that." She set the scraps down. "But look at this one. Carver Doyle. New gate hinges, custom width. What did he pay?" Thorne told her. "Carver Doyle owns the second largest cattle operation north of the ridge. He does not have 4 kids he's feeding on a thin margin." She held the scrap up. "He paid you less than Oswald Briggs did." Thorne looked at the scrap. Then he looked at her. "He told me times were lean," he said, slowly. "Did he?" It wasn't a question. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I'm not good at the money part." "I know," she said, not unkindly. "I am. Let me do it." He looked at her for a moment with that assessing steadiness she was coming to know as just the way he looked at things he was deciding about. Then he reached into his apron pocket and produced a small key and handed it to her without a word. She didn't know what it unlocked yet. She found out the next morning, the strongbox under the floorboard in the bedroom. She opened it and sat back on her heels and stared at what was inside for a good 2 minutes. It wasn't nothing, but it was a great deal less than it should have been for a man who'd been running the only blacksmith forge in a 40-mile radius for over a decade. She started a ledger that afternoon. Carver Doyle came back 3 weeks later with a broken wheel rim. Marlowe was in the house when she heard his voice through the open window, and she recognized it because she'd made a point of learning every name that appeared in that box of receipts and putting a face to each one. She set down the mending she'd been doing and went to the doorway of the forge. Thorne was already examining the rim. Doyle was a big man, well-fed, with a silver watch chain that caught the afternoon light and clearly wanted to. "Same as last time," Doyle was saying. "Whatever you can do." "I'll need 2 days on this," Thorne said. "The weld's cracked all the way through. It's not a simple repair." "2 days?" Doyle sucked his teeth. "I'll give you the same rate as the hinges." "No," Marlowe said. Both men turned to look at her. She stepped out of the doorway and came to stand beside Thorne. She had the ledger under her arm. She didn't open it. She didn't need to. "The hinge work was already underpriced by a third," she said pleasantly. "For a 2-day repair on a wheel rim this size, the rate is $22. That covers iron cost, coal, and my husband's labor at a fair rate for a skilled tradesman." Doyle stared at her. He had the particular look of a man who had not anticipated having to negotiate with someone like her and found the situation disorienting. "That's a steep jump from what I paid before," he said. "It is," she agreed. "Because what you paid before wasn't the right price. It was the price Mr. Calloway gave you because he's a man who doesn't enjoy the business side of things, and you took advantage of that." She smiled at him. "I do enjoy it, Mr. Doyle. So the rate going forward is the right rate." Doyle looked at Thorne. The look was an appeal. Man to man, surely you can handle this woman. Thorne looked back at him with an expression of complete tranquility. $22, he said. Doyle's jaw worked. He looked between them one more time. Then he reached into his coat. He paid. After he left, Thorne looked at Marlowe. She was already writing the transaction in the ledger, neat and precise. "That's going to make some enemies," he said. "It's going to make some enemies who need to pay their bills," she said without looking up. "Those two things aren't the same problem." He leaned against the workbench and watched her write. "You're not afraid of him," Thorne said. "No." She capped the ink. "I've been afraid of men like Carver Doyle my whole life. I've been afraid of what they'd say about me, what they'd think, whether they'd laugh." She closed the ledger. "I'm done with that now. It got me nothing, and it cost me a great deal." He nodded slowly. He didn't ask anything more. He picked up the wheel rim and carried it to the forge. The months moved the way time moves in hard-working places. Not fast and not slow, but steadily, like water finding its level. Marlowe settled into Dry Creek Ridge the way a stone settles into soil. Slowly, with resistance at first, and then deeper and more permanently than anyone expected. She kept the books, and she kept them ruthlessly well. She corrected 6 years of undercharging in the first 2 months and added 15% to every new contract without apology. She started a record of which customers paid on time and which ones needed 3 requests, and she began applying a small late fee to the second group, which caused consternation and muttering but was legally defensible, and she had made sure of that before she implemented it. At the same time, she was not cruel about it. When Ed Harker's youngest broke his leg and the family had a hard month, she went to Thorne quietly and said, "Don't put Harker's account in the late column this month." And Thorne didn't. When the widow Cassidy's fence post needed resetting and she clearly had no money for it, Marlowe arranged for Thorne to do it on a Saturday morning and recorded it internally as a charitable loss and mentioned it to no one. The distinction was between people who couldn't pay and people who chose not to because they'd decided the blacksmith would accept whatever they offered. The first group she helped. The second group she charged correctly, and if they didn't like it, they were welcome to the next nearest forge, which was 40 miles away in Cutter's Bend. Most of them, after the initial outrage, paid. It was a Tuesday, and what had become early autumn, when the thing in Dolan's general store happened, and it changed things in a way that couldn't be changed back. Marlowe had gone in for flour, salt, and a length of cotton she'd been putting off buying. She had the list in her apron pocket, and she was working through it systematically when she became aware of a group of women near the dry goods shelves at the back of the store. 3 of them. She knew their names, and she knew most names in Dry Creek Ridge by then. Ruth Baxter, who was the mill owner's wife. Connie Flett, who kept the boarding house on 2nd Street. And Dell Grimes, who was Hector Grimes' wife. A small, hard-eyed woman who moved through the world with the particular sourness of someone who'd chosen to build her sense of self around her husband's cruelty and had to keep defending that choice. They saw Marlo the moment she came in. She saw them see her. She kept moving toward the flour barrel. "There she is," Dell Grimes said, not quietly. "The Calloway bride." She gave the word bride a particular inflection, the kind that puts quotation marks around something without using them. Marlo measured her flour. "I heard she's been charging people double at the forge," Ruth Baxter said, "for work Thorne used to do for a reasonable price." "Reasonable for everyone except Thorne," Marlo said without turning around. Her voice was even. "He was running a charity operation. I just converted it to a business." Silence for a beat. Then Dell Grimes moved a few steps closer. "You know," Dell said, "most women who come into a situation like yours, into a town where nobody wanted them, would try to make themselves a little more," she paused, the pause doing the work she wanted it to do, "agreeable." Marlo set down the flour scoop and turned around. Dell Grimes was maybe 5 feet from her. Ruth Baxter and Connie Flett were a step behind in the particular formation of women who want to watch something happen without being technically responsible for starting it. "Agreeable," Marlo repeated. "That's right." Dell folded her hands in front of her. "Instead of coming in here stirring things up, making enemies of people, acting like you run the place." A small smile. "You don't run the place, honey. You're barely tolerated in it." The store had gone quiet. Ed Dolan, behind the counter, was suddenly deeply interested in something under the register. 2 other customers near the canned goods were not quite looking. Marlo looked at Dell Grimes, and she thought about all the things she could say. She could be measured and quiet and take the high road, which she'd done many times before in many situations, and which had taught her that the high road was very nice, but that it didn't actually stop people from doing the same thing again. "You know what I think, Mrs. Grimes?" she said. "Do tell." "I think you came over here because you wanted to feel large by making me feel small, and I think you've been very good at that with other people. And I think it's worked for you often enough that you counted on it working now." She took a step forward. She was taller than Dell Grimes. She was considerably larger than Dell Grimes, and she did not step back, and she did not shrink. And Dell Grimes, for the first time in the encounter, looked uncertain. "It's not going to work," Marlo said quietly. "Not now, not next time, not ever again with me. So I'd encourage you to take that strategy and retire it where I'm concerned, because you'll just be wasting both our time." Dell Grimes' face had gone through several colors. It had landed on something between outrage and a kind of startled blankness. "How dare," she started. "That's enough." The voice came from the front door. Hector Grimes stood in the doorway of the general store, and whatever had begun as a wife's petty cruelty had just acquired a different and more dangerous quality. He'd clearly caught enough of it through the open door to know the shape of what was happening, and his face had taken on the particular set that it wore when he'd decided something had gone from entertainment to affront. He came in slowly. He was bigger in a confined space. The store felt smaller. "You don't talk to my wife that way," he said to Marlo. His voice had dropped to something quiet and flat, which was, she'd already learned, more dangerous than when he was loud. "Your wife came across the store to talk to me," Marlo said. Her voice was steady, steadier than she felt. "I'm just talking back. She says you're running up prices, running your mouth, acting like you own this town." "Hector." The word came from the door. Thorne Calloway stepped inside. She didn't know how long he'd been there. She couldn't tell from his face whether he'd heard everything or just the end of it. But he was there, and the dynamics of the room shifted immediately and completely, because whatever people thought of Thorne Calloway and his burned face, they had a very clear understanding of what he was capable of at the forge and what that translated to in terms of simple physical capability, and not a person in Dry Creek Ridge had forgotten it. Hector Grimes turned. He was a large man. He was not an unintelligent man. He ran the calculus quickly. "Stay out of this, Calloway." "I'll stay out of it when you move away from my wife," Thorne said. He said it without raising his voice. He stepped further into the store, unhurried. He stopped when he was between Marlowe and Hector, not pushing, not aggressive, just present. "That's the only version of staying out of it that's available to me." Hector looked at Thorne. He looked at the store full of witnesses. He looked at Dell, who had developed a sudden interest in the floor. The calculation shifted again. "This isn't over," Hector said to Marlowe, just to Marlowe, pointedly past Thorne. "Then I'll see you next time," she said. He held her eyes for a moment. Then he turned and walked out. And after a beat, Dell followed him, and Ruth Baxter and Connie Flett found somewhere else urgently to be. The store was quiet. Ed Dolan emerged from behind his register. "You all right, Mrs. Calloway?" "Fine. Thank you, Ed." She turned back to the flour barrel and picked up the scoop. "I still need about 4 pounds of this." Thorne came to stand beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him. "You all right?" he asked quietly. "Yes." "You're shaking a little." She looked at her hands. He was right. Not much, but present. "Adrenaline," she said. "I hate that my body does that even when my head is fine." He didn't try to fix it or explain it away. He just stood there beside her while she measured flour, a solid and unhurried presence, until her hands steadied. On the walk back, he didn't ask for details about what happened before he arrived. She told him some of it anyway, the broad shape of it, because she'd decided early on that keeping things from him was not the kind of marriage she wanted to build. He listened. He didn't interrupt. When she finished, he said, "Hector's been running that town with his mouth for 15 years. Nobody pushes back on him." "I noticed." "It won't stop at one argument in a store." "I know." She shifted the flour sack. "Does that bother you?" He was quiet for a moment. "Not in the way you might think." He took the flour sack from her without comment, just reached over and took it. "What bothers me is that you had to do it alone in there for however long before I came in." "I can handle myself." "I know you can. That's not what I said." She thought about that. "No," she said. "It wasn't, was it?" They walked the rest of the way in silence, but it was a different kind of silence than the first week's silence. It had more in it. The gossip network in Dry Creek Ridge was fast and ran in every direction simultaneously, and the story of what happened in Dolan's store had made its way through most of the town by nightfall. The versions varied, as versions always do. Some had Marlowe screaming at Dell Grimes. Some had Hector throwing something, which hadn't happened. One version, which reached them secondhand through their neighbor Addie Marsh, had Thorne physically throwing Hector out the door, which also hadn't happened, but had the ring of something people wanted to have happened, and therefore were willing to believe. What was consistent across every version was one thing: Marlowe Calloway had not backed down. That detail apparently caused some friction with the established understanding of how things worked in Dry Creek Ridge, where the general social contract had been, for some time, that Hector Grimes said what he wanted and people arranged themselves around that fact. The idea that a woman, and a woman who, the town had assumed, would be particularly vulnerable to Hector's specific brand of cruelty, had simply refused to participate in the arrangement was causing a kind of low-grade reconsideration in certain quarters. It didn't translate into anything immediate. People still moved differently around Hector on the street. Old habits and old fears don't clear overnight. But the quality of the silence around the Calloway name changed slightly, less contempt in it, more something else. Not quite respect yet, but a kind of watchfulness. The town paying closer attention. Marlowe felt it but didn't count on it. She'd been in Dry Creek Ridge long enough to understand that watchful interest could turn in either direction. What none of them knew yet, not Marlowe, not Thorne, and not the watchful town, was that a man named Silas Cutter had been paying attention to the Calloway Forge for considerably longer than the rest of them. Silas Cutter owned the Broken Horn Ranch, which ran from the eastern ridge down through the valley floor, and encompassed, by the most generous estimates, something close to 12,000 acres. He was 61 years old, had been married twice with neither wife surviving the experience happily, and had a way of sitting very still in rooms that made the rooms feel smaller. He was not the kind of man who raised his voice. He was the kind of man who sent other men to do the raising for him. He had wanted the land the Calloway Forge sat on for 3 years. It wasn't the forge itself that interested him particularly. It was the water rights attached to the property. A secondary creek branch that cut along the eastern edge of Thorne's land and fed directly into the main water source for the valley's southern grazing fields. Those water rights, if transferred to the Broken Horn, would give Cutter legal control over approximately a third of the water access for the entire region's farming and ranching operations, which was a kind of power that made even large amounts of money look modest by comparison. Thorne had turned him down twice. The first time 3 years ago, the second time 14 months back. Both times politely. Both times finally. Cutter had not pushed harder yet because there had been no urgency to push. Thorne was alone, isolated, had no family, no real allies in town. The assumption had been that eventually the situation would resolve itself, that Thorne would age or struggle or simply decide the battle wasn't worth it. A man alone, with half the town against him, only had so much endurance. What Cutter had not accounted for was Marlowe. He became aware of her in the incremental way that calculating men become aware of things that threaten their calculations. Not all at once, but through accumulation of small signals. The corrected pricing at the forge, the ledger system, the growing murmur that the Calloway business was, against all prior expectation, becoming something solid and prosperous. And then the incident at Dolan's store, which had come to him through his foreman, who had been in the feed store next door and heard everything through the shared wall. A woman who didn't scare, who managed money, who had walked into a situation that everyone assumed would break her and had not broken. Cutter sat in his large chair in his large house and thought about this for 2 evenings. Then he sent a letter. The letter arrived on a Thursday morning, hand-delivered by one of Cutter's ranch hands, a quiet young man named Pete, who handed it over without meeting Thorne's eyes and rode away before questions could be asked. Thorne brought it inside and set it on the table without opening it. He looked at it for a moment. Then he called Marlowe. She came in from the back, wiping her hands. She looked at the envelope. She looked at him. "What is it?" "Letter from Silas Cutter." She knew the name. She'd found it in the receipts box. Cutter had purchased ironwork from Thorne in the early years, before whatever had happened between them. She'd also heard the name twice in conversation, both times in the tone people use for men they're careful around. "You're not going to open it," she said. Not quite a question. "I'm deciding," he said. "Open it, Thorne." He opened it. It was short, 3 paragraphs. The language was courteous in the way that knives are sometimes polished before use. It expressed admiration for the Calloway Forge's reputation and longevity. It acknowledged the previous conversations about the property, and it made a new offer. A number that was nearly twice the previous offer, a number that was, by any fair measure, a great deal of money. At the bottom, after the number, was a single additional sentence. "I hope very much that we can reach an agreement, as the alternative is a matter I would prefer not to contemplate." Marlowe read it twice. Then she set it down. "That last sentence," she said. "Yes," Thorne said. "That's a threat." "Yes," he said again. "It is." She looked at the paper for another moment. What's he actually after? He doesn't need a forge. Thorne told her about the water rights then, all of it, both previous conversations, the nature of the creek branch, and what controlling it would mean. He told it flatly, without drama, the way he told most things, but she could hear underneath the flatness a long-held anger, low and hot, like banked coals. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment, thinking. "If he gets those water rights," she said, "how many families in this valley does that affect?" "Directly, maybe 40, through secondary effects. Every farm and small ranch that depends on the downstream irrigation, closer to 100. And he knows this. He built his whole plan around this." She looked at her husband. In the year, almost exactly 1 year now, she'd been counting, that she'd known Thorne Calloway, she had come to understand him in the way you come to understand something that doesn't announce itself but that reveals itself steadily, through action rather than declaration. He was not a complicated man, but he was a deep one. And underneath the quietness and the self-sufficiency and the years of being alone was a bone-level stubbornness about certain things, a refusal to be moved on matters he'd decided were not movable. She recognized it because she had the same thing. "Right back," she said. "Marlowe, right back today. Decline the offer. Don't mention the threat. Don't respond to it. Don't acknowledge it. Just decline the offer on the property." She met his eyes. "If he wants a fight, he has to come and start it himself. We don't walk toward it." Thorne looked at her for a long moment. "If he comes and starts it, then we deal with what he actually does," she said. "Not with what he implies he might do. That's what men like Cutter count on, that you'll scare yourself with possibilities and give them what they want before they have to actually do anything." She shook her head. "I spent 31 years being managed by possibilities. I'm finished with it." He looked at her with that look she still didn't have a complete name for. Then he went to the desk, took out paper and ink, and wrote the reply. She watched him write it. His hand still pressed hard into the page, fighting the pen, but the words came quickly and they were clear. He sealed it and handed it to her. "You should be the one to send it," he said. She carried it to the postal office herself in the afternoon, walking down Main Street at her usual unhurried pace, nodding to the people she knew, stopping to ask after Addie Marsh's husband who'd had a bad cough last week. She dropped the letter in the post slot. Then she walked home. Behind her, without her seeing it, two men she didn't know yet were watching from the far end of the street, tracking her, and then tracking the postal office, and then turning and walking in the direction of the road east, toward the Broken Horn. The season was changing. The mornings had started to carry cold in them, the kind of cold that was polite so far, but intended to get less polite soon. Winter was coming, and something else was coming with it, though it hadn't yet taken a shape that could be named. She felt it when she walked in the door of her own house. Some instinct, imprecise and low in her chest, like a sound at the edge of hearing. She stood in the kitchen for a moment, not sure what to do with the feeling, and then she shook her head at herself and started on supper, because there was nothing else to do yet but work and wait and stay ready. And those were three things, as it turned out, that Marlowe Calloway was very good at. The cold came early that year, and it came mean. By the second week of November, the ridge that gave the town its name had gone white at the top, and the wind that pushed down from it carried a bite that made even the horses reluctant in the mornings. Marlowe had started keeping a second lamp burning in the evenings, and Thorne had split and stacked enough firewood against the side of the house that it formed a wall nearly shoulder high, which she'd thought was excessive until the first real cold front moved through, and she understood that he'd lived through these winters before and knew something she didn't. She was still learning that about him, the ways he prepared for things without announcing the preparation, the way he'd quietly reinforced the forge's roof before the first frost, replacing two boards she hadn't even noticed were soft. The way he'd checked the water barrels and the chicken coop and the hinges on the storm shutters, all of it done without commentary, without asking for acknowledgement, just done, because it needed doing, and he was the kind of man who did what needed doing and moved on. She was trying to be that kind of woman. She wasn't always there yet. The ledger had grown into something she was genuinely proud of. 3 months of correct pricing, careful recording, and the quiet exercise of charging people what the work actually cost had produced a number in the strongbox under the bedroom floor that was, by her calculation, nearly 4 times what had been there when she arrived. It wasn't wealth. It wasn't even security in the deep sense. But it was proof of concept, proof that the forge, under honest management, could sustain them and then some. She'd started thinking about expansion, a second bellows, possibly a small shop front where she could sell finished ironwork directly, rather than only taking commissions. She hadn't said any of it to Thorne yet. She was waiting for the right moment, which she'd learned meant waiting until his hands were still, because when his hands were working, his mind was somewhere she couldn't fully reach. Silas Cutter had not responded to their letter. That was, in some ways, worse than a response would have been. The second letter arrived not to the house but to the forge itself, slid under the door sometime in the night so that Thorne found it on the floor when he came to start the morning fire. He picked it up and looked at it for a moment before he came back inside. Marlowe was at the stove. She heard him come in and turned at the quality of his silence. He set the letter on the table. It wasn't from Cutter this time. No ranch letterhead, no polished language. It was a plain sheet, and the writing on it was rough and large, the writing of someone not accustomed to writing, or someone who wanted it to look that way. Last chance on the property. Take the money. Accidents happen in forge fires. Don't make us prove it. She read it twice. She felt her jaw tighten. When did this arrive? She asked. Overnight. It was under the door. Cutter. Not his handwriting, his instruction. Thorne sat down. He put his hands flat on the table. This is how he works. He doesn't sign anything. He never does anything you can prove. Can we take this to the sheriff? Thorne looked at her with an expression that told her the answer before he said it. Dale Purvis has been sheriff for 9 years. He hunts on Cutter's land by invitation every autumn. He's not a corrupt man, exactly, but he's a man who understands where the weight sits. So not the sheriff, she said. Not yet. Not with just a letter with no signature. She looked at the paper again. Accidents happen in forge fires. She thought about the forge. She thought about Thorne inside it, the fire going, the coals at working temperature, and what a determined and ruthless man with hired help might be able to engineer in that environment. We need to be more careful, she said. Yes. The forge. We need to never leave it unattended when it's hot. And at night, she stopped. Thorne, has anyone been near the property lately? Anyone you didn't know? He was quiet for a moment. 2 weeks ago, a man I didn't recognize was standing at the far end of the side road. He moved off when I came out. I thought he was lost. He wasn't lost. No, Thorne said. Probably not. She folded the letter carefully and put it in the back of the ledger. Evidence was evidence even when the sheriff wouldn't act on it yet. You kept it because you might need it later, and when you needed it later, you needed it to still exist. We tell Addie Marsh, she said. Addie lived 3 houses away, and her bedroom window looked straight down the side road toward the forge. She was a light sleeper and a sharp-eyed woman who missed very little. Not everything, but we tell her to watch and tell us if she sees anyone near the property after dark. You trust Addie? Yes. He nodded. All right. She poured them both coffee. The morning was pressing against the windows, gray and cold. She sat down across from him and wrapped her hands around her mug, and they sat there for a while without speaking. Not because there was nothing to say, but because some things needed to sit in silence for a minute before you could talk around them properly. I'm not leaving this property, Thorne said finally. His voice was quiet and completely certain. I know you're not. The water rights from that creek feed 12 farms besides ours. If Cutter gets control of it, I know what it means, she said. I've talked to enough people in this town to know. She looked at him. We're not leaving, Thorne. I didn't come out here to leave. He looked at her across the table. In the gray morning light, with the coffee steam between them and the cold pressing at the glass, she thought she could see in his face a man who had spent so many years expecting things to be taken from him that the experience of someone standing beside him instead of stepping away was still, even after a year, something he hadn't entirely finished processing. She understood that. She hadn't finished processing it either. Whatever comes, she said, we handle it together. He put his hand over hers on the table. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. Mashva Mamtal. 3 days later, Hector Grimes came to the forge. Not to commission work. He came alone mid-morning, when he must have known Thorne would be inside working. He stood in the doorway of the forge with his hands in his coat pockets, and he watched Thorne work for a moment before he spoke. Cutter wants an answer, Hector said. Thorne didn't stop working. Cutter got an answer. A different answer. Hector moved inside a step. The heat from the forge hit him, and he blinked but didn't back up. A smarter one. Hector. Thorne set down the hammer. He turned around. The firelight caught the scarred side of his face and made it look even more severe than it did in daylight. He looked at Hector steadily. How long have you been running errands for Cutter? Something flickered across Hector's face. It's not. I'm just passing a message. You've always been good at that, Thorne said. Finding the thing you can do for a powerful man that makes you feel like some of his power rubs off. He picked up his hammer again, not in a threatening way, just a working man picking up his tool. Go back and tell Cutter the answer is the same answer it's always been. And tell him I know the letter under the door was his doing. That information's written down, and it's not only in my house. Hector went still. What letter? He knows what letter. A beat of silence. Hector looked around the forge, at the coals, at the tools hanging on the walls, at the layout of the space, and Thorne saw him looking and understood what the looking meant and moved 2 steps to the left, which put him between Hector and the quench barrel. Hector caught the movement. He understood what it meant too. He'd underestimated the man's alertness, and he knew it now. "This doesn't end well for you," Hector said. The bravado was mostly still there, but there was something under it now, something less comfortable. "Maybe not," Thorne said, "but it ends the same way regardless. That's the thing about certain kinds of decisions. Once you've made them, the outcome doesn't change them." Hector looked at him for another moment. Then he left. Thorne stood in the forge for a while after he was gone. Then he went to find Marlowe. She was in the house with the ledger open when he told her. She listened to all of it, her pen still in her hand, not writing. "He was looking at the layout," she said when he finished. "Yes." "He was reporting back on it." "Yes." She set the pen down. "We need to move the strongbox." "I was thinking the same thing. Not in the bedroom anymore. Somewhere outside the main structures," she thought. "The root cellar, it's separate from the house and the forge both. If they hit the buildings, they don't automatically get the cellar." Thorne looked at her. "You're thinking about fire." "I'm thinking about everything," she said. "If I were Cutter and I'd been patient for 3 years and now I have a deadline in my own head, what would I do?" She looked at him. "I would move before winter locks everything down, before the ground freezes. I'd want it done while there's still enough going on, weather, darkness, cold keeping people indoors, to cover it." "That's the next few weeks," Thorne said. "Yes," she said. "It is." She wasn't wrong, and they both knew it, and that knowledge sat between them like a third person at the table for the rest of that evening. The blizzard came on a Thursday. It had been threatening for 2 days. The sky had that flat, pressurized look that people who live at altitude learn to read, and the temperature had dropped further each morning. Addie Marsh had stopped Marlowe on Wednesday afternoon to say her hip was aching something terrible, which was Addie's reliable personal weather instrument, and that she expected a bad one by end of week. She was right. By Thursday evening, the wind had picked up to a mean, sustained howl, and the snow was coming sideways, thick and fast, the kind of snow that wasn't decorative in any sense. It was the kind of snow that meant business. Thorne had banked the forge early and come inside before dark, which he didn't usually do. They ate together, a quiet meal, and afterward she washed the plates and he put 2 extra pieces of wood on the stove, and the house creaked around them in the wind but held. She went to bed first. She lay in the dark listening to the storm and that low instinct in her chest, the one she'd felt the evening she posted Cutter's refusal, the sound at the edge of hearing feeling, was back, louder now, though she still couldn't name what it was telling her. She was still awake when she heard it. Not the wind she'd been hearing for hours. This was something inside the sound of the wind, a different quality. A crash, sharp and specific, from the direction of the forge. She was out of bed before she'd decided to move. She pulled on her boots and her coat over her nightgown, and she opened the bedroom door, and Thorne was already up, already at the front door, and she could see from the set of his shoulders that he'd heard it too. He opened the front door. The cold hit them like a hand, flat and hard. Through the driving snow she could see orange. Not the low orange of banked coals, but the high, climbing orange of something that had gotten out of containment. The forge roof was lit from within. "Stay here," Thorne said. "No," she said. He was already moving. She was right behind him. The snow was ankle-deep already and coming fast, and the wind was fighting them every step. The side road to the forge was maybe 40 yards from the house door, but it was 40 yards through a wall of weather, and by the time Thorne rounded the corner of the forge, she was 10 feet behind him and already couldn't feel her face. What she saw stopped her for 1 second. There were 4 of them. Men she didn't know or couldn't see clearly. Their faces were covered, scarves and hat brims pulled down, which told her everything about how planned this was. 2 of them had been at the forge door, which was where the fire had been set. She could see now it was contained to the entryway, not yet into the main structure, a fire built against the base of the wooden doorframe. The other 2 were to Thorne's right, and they'd come out of the dark fast, before he'd fully taken in what he was looking at. She heard the sound of the first impact, a hard, dense sound, and saw Thorn stagger. "Thorn!" He caught himself against the wall of the forge. The two men closed on him, and she could see in the way he moved that he was hurt, something wrong with how he was holding his left side. But he was still on his feet, and he put one of the men down hard before the second one got behind him. The two at the door turned when they heard her shout. One of them started toward her. She had run out of the house in her nightgown and coat and boots, and she had brought nothing with her because she hadn't thought. She'd just moved, and now a man twice her size was coming through the snow toward her, and she took 2 steps back before she felt it. The long handle of the forge's outdoor tool rack, mounted on the exterior wall just beside where she was standing. The tools were right there, sitting in their iron hooks. She knew every one of them by name by now. She'd organized that rack herself. She reached up and took down the sledgehammer. It was heavy. It was heavier than anything she'd ever lifted intentionally, and it was awkward in the dark and the snow, the long handle wanting to pull it away from her. She didn't get it up over her shoulder. She didn't need to. She turned it, got both hands around the neck of the handle, shorter grip, more control, and when the man reached her, she didn't swing it. She drove it forward like a battering ram, the iron head leading, all her weight behind it, and she hit him square in the sternum. He went down. He went down hard, and he didn't get up immediately, and she didn't wait to see when he would. She turned toward the forge. Thorn was on one knee. The second man had a hold of him from behind, and the first man she'd seen go down was getting back up. The two who'd been at the door, one of them was moving toward Thorn too, which made 3 against 1 man who was already hurt. She moved. She crossed the distance in the snow faster than she would have thought she could move, the sledgehammer in both hands, and she went for the nearest one, the man getting back up from where Thorn had put him. She didn't calculate it. She didn't have time to calculate it. She swung the hammer sidelong at the back of his knee, and he buckled with a shout, and went down again, and stayed down. "Hey!" The shout came from the man holding Thorn from behind. He'd seen her. He'd registered that his number was shifting in a direction he hadn't planned for. Thorn used the distraction. He got his elbow back and caught the man in the face with it, a short, brutal strike, and the grip on him loosened enough for him to drive backward and slam the man into the forge wall. The man hit the wood siding with a sound like a dropped sack and sat down. That left one. The man who'd been closest to the forge door, the last one standing. He looked at Marlowe. He looked at the sledgehammer in her hands. He looked at Thorn, who had straightened from the wall and was breathing hard through gritted teeth, with his left arm held careful at his side, but was nonetheless standing and facing him. He looked at the man she'd put down in the snow, who still hadn't gotten up. He ran. The footsteps went fast into the dark, and the blizzard swallowed them. Marlowe stood in the snow with the sledgehammer still in both hands and watched the darkness where he'd disappeared. She was shaking all over, not just her hands. Her whole body was shaking with the adrenaline and the cold and the pure animal voltage of what had just happened. "Marlowe," Thorn's voice. She turned. He was still on his feet, but his color was bad in the firelight from the burning door frame, and his left arm was wrong. "The fire," she said. "Quench barrels inside. I can get to it. The door's burning. You can't go through it." "The side access." He was already moving, angling around to the far side of the forge. She followed him, and he was right. The side access door, a smaller service entrance, was clear. He got it open and went in, and she heard the sound of the quench barrel being dragged, and then the hiss and steam of water meeting fire, and then more water, and after a long moment, the orange glow at the front of the forge began to dim. She stood outside in the snow and watched the front of the building. The fire hadn't gotten into the main structure. The door frame was charred. Part of the front wall was scorched, but the stone and iron of the forge itself had resisted. It had been built to resist fire. That was all, she thought with a strange detached clarity, the one good irony of the situation. When Thorn came back out through the side door, she could see in the way he was moving how much he was managing. He was walking upright through will. The left arm was held against his body. "Let me see it," she said. "It's fine." "Thorn." She stepped in front of him, and he stopped. She put her hand carefully on his left arm, and he made a short, involuntary sound. "That's not fine. Is it broken? I don't think so. Might be cracked. It'll be all right. We need to get inside, she said. You need to be warm, and I need to look at that arm, and we need to deal with him. She gestured behind her. The man she'd driven the sledgehammer into was still down, sitting up now in the snow, both arms around his own midsection. He wasn't going anywhere. The two that Thorne had dealt with had gotten up and gone at some point during the end of the fight. She wasn't sure when. But this one was still here, and he was conscious and not visibly bleeding, and he was going to tell her what she needed to know. She walked over to him. She still had the sledgehammer, though she'd lowered it to her side. He looked up at her. He was young. Younger than she'd expected, maybe 25, with a narrow face and frightened eyes. "Who sent you?" she asked. He looked away from her. "You're sitting in a blizzard with a bruised chest on someone else's property after setting fire to someone else's forge. The law is not going to be kind about that." She crouched down, which put her face level with his. "Whoever sent you didn't stay to help you. Look around. Your friends left. He sent you here and then made sure he was nowhere near here. That's what he does." She waited. "Tell me who sent you, and it helps you considerably more than it helps him." The young man in the snow looked at her. He looked at Thorne, who had come to stand behind her. He looked at the charred door frame and the darkness where his partners had gone. His jaw worked for a moment. "Cutter," he said. His voice was rough. "Silas Cutter. He sent Riley to organize it. Riley Marsh, but not from here, from Cutter's Bend. He was the one who ran." He swallowed. "We were supposed to burn the forge down and—" He stopped. "And what?" Thorne said. The young man looked at the snow. "Make sure you couldn't put out the fire. Whatever that took." The blizzard filled the silence after that. "What's your name?" Marlowe asked. He looked up. "Does it matter?" "Yes." A pause. "Cyrus Webb." "All right, Cyrus Webb." She stood up. "You're going to sit there until I bring rope from inside, and then you're going to let me tie your hands, and then you're going to spend the rest of this blizzard in our root cellar, which is warm enough and dry enough. And in the morning, when the snow clears enough to get to town, we're going to take you to the sheriff together, and you're going to repeat to him exactly what you just told me, all of it, including Riley Marsh and including Cutter." Cutter'll what?" she said. "You're already caught. The worst he can do to you now is nothing compared to what happens if you stay silent and take all of this alone." She looked at him steadily. "You're 20-something years old. You don't have to spend the next decade paying for Silas Cutter's land grab." One thorough check, and she stood outside in the snow in the dark while he did it, shaking steadily, the cold having found its way through every layer she had. And then she walked him firmly inside and shut the door. She got the lamp on and looked at his arm properly, and her first assessment had been right. Not broken, or not visibly broken, but badly bruised along the forearm and with a tenderness at the wrist that worried her. She wrapped it tight with a length of linen torn from the hem of a sheet and made him hold it elevated while she got the fire in the stove built up high. And then she put water on and found the last of the whiskey she'd been using for medicinal purposes and made him drink some of it, and he made a face but drank it. "How's your head?" she asked. She'd seen the first impact, the blow they'd gotten in before he'd fully seen them coming. "Hard," he said. "Thorne." "There's a headache," he said. "Not the kind that means something bad, just the kind that means someone hit me." She looked at his eyes, both pupils the same size. That was the main thing. She'd been told once, years ago, by a woman who'd been a nurse briefly. If the pupils are even, it's probably not a bad injury. She didn't know how much to trust that, but it was what she had. "Stay awake for a while," she said. "I'm not going to sleep, Marlowe." "Good." She sat down across from him. She looked at her own hands. They were red from the cold, and there was a blister forming on her right palm from the sledgehammer handle. She hadn't felt it during. She felt it now. "You came through the snow," Thorne said. "You came through the snow first. I told you to stay inside." "I know." She flexed her fingers, testing the blister. "I decided not to." He looked at her across the table. The lamp was between them, and his face in the lamplight was everything that had frightened this town for years. The scarred side, the severity of it, the way the firelight caught the ridged skin and made it look molten. She'd looked at that face for a year now across this table, and the fear other people felt had never made sense to her because she'd only ever looked at it and seen him. There were 4 of them, he said, and now there's one in the root cellar, and the rest are trying to explain to Riley Marsh why it went wrong, she said. Marlowe. He said her name the way he sometimes did, not as a question or a call, just as a word he needed to say. You charged into 4 men in a blizzard in your nightgown with a sledgehammer. You charged into 4 men with a cracked arm. I didn't know the arm was cracked yet. Fair point. He was quiet for a moment. Where did you even... The sledgehammer was outside, on the wall rack. I reorganized the tool rack in September, she said. Heaviest tools at the easiest reach so you don't have to lift overhead when you're already tired from the forge work. She met his eyes. Turns out that's useful for other things too. Something crossed his face that she recognized now. It was the expression he wore when something moved him, and he didn't quite know what to do with that. It was the expression she'd first seen in the doorway of the forge 6 months ago, when she told him she was done spending her life being small. Come here, he said. She went around the table and he pulled her against his good side with his good arm, and she let him because she was cold all the way through, and her hands were hurting, and the adrenaline had nowhere to go anymore, and she pressed her forehead against the side of his neck and stayed there. The storm hammered the windows. The stove ticked and popped. In the root cellar, Cyrus Webb was presumably doing whatever young men who've made serious mistakes do when they're alone in the dark, with the weight of it. The sheriff in the morning, she said against his collar. In the morning, he agreed, soon as the road clears enough. Cyrus will talk. He was already halfway there before I finished the sentence. I know. If he names Riley Marsh and Marsh names Cutter, it might be enough, Thorne said, even for Purvis. It has to be enough, she said. We have the letter. We have a witness. We have the physical evidence on the property. She pushed back enough to look at him. This ends, Thorne. This particular play of his ends in the morning. He looked at her, his brown eyes steady, the way it always was, the way she'd built her own steadiness against for a year now. You sound sure of that, he said. I'm not completely sure, she said, but I'm going to act like I am, because that's the only version of tomorrow that I can do anything useful inside of. He made a sound that might have been a short, rough laugh, which was Thorne's version of laughing. All right, he said. Tomorrow then. Dutchand. She stayed against his side and the storm went on, and the fire in the stove was warm and the lamp between them burned steady. And outside the snow was covering everything, covering the charred doorframe, covering the marks in the snow where 4 men had come with violence and left without winning, covering the footprints of a woman who had run through a blizzard toward danger instead of away from it, and was still there afterward, intact and not going anywhere. The blizzard broke sometime before dawn. Marlowe knew because the sound changed. The sustained, pressurized howl dropped off gradually, like something letting go of a long-held breath, and by the time gray light started showing at the edges of the window shutters, the wind had settled to an occasional gust rather than a constant assault. She hadn't slept. She wasn't sure Thorne had either, though he'd been still against her side for a few hours with his eyes closed, which was probably the best either of them was going to get. She got up carefully so as not to jar his arm and went to the window. Outside the world was white and clean and completely indifferent to what had happened in it the night before. The snow had covered everything to a depth of nearly 2 feet in the open areas, more where it had drifted against structures. The side road to the forge was a smooth, unbroken surface. You'd never know, looking at it, that 4 men had come through it in the dark with fire and bad intentions. She put the coffee on. She checked her hand. The blister on her right palm had settled into a tight, shiny dome that was going to be inconvenient for several days. She could move all her fingers without issue, which was the main thing. Thorne came into the kitchen while she was cutting bread. He'd slept in his clothes and his hair was pushed sideways, and he was holding his left arm with the kind of careful, unconscious attention of someone managing pain without wanting to discuss it. "How's the arm?" she asked. "Stiff," he said. "Better than last night." "That's not a high bar." "No." He sat down. He looked at her hand when she set his coffee in front of him. "Your palm." "It's fine." "Marlowe." It's a blister, Thorne. I've had worse from the wash basin. She sat down across from him. We need to get to the sheriff before Cutter's men have time to get to him first. Purvis lives on the north end. Roads will still be bad up there. Then we start now. She wrapped her hands around her mug. I don't want to give Cutter any more hours to manage this than he already has. If Riley Marsh or anyone else got back to Cutter last night, he's already thinking about how to reshape the story. Thorne nodded slowly. What about Cyrus? She'd been thinking about that. He comes with us. He walks to the sheriff's office between us in daylight, where anyone in town can see. That way Cutter can't claim we held him against his will, and it also means Cutter can't make Cyrus disappear before he gives his statement. Thorne looked at her over his coffee. You think Cutter would make him disappear? I think Cutter's been careful for 61 years not to leave evidence behind him. I think Cyrus Webb is currently the most significant piece of evidence we have. And yes, I think Silas Cutter is exactly the kind of man who would do whatever it took to keep that young man from talking. She set her mug down. So we don't give him the opportunity. Thorne drained his coffee. He stood up. I'll get him from the cellar, he said. Cyrus Webb in daylight looked younger than he had in the snow. He was cold and stiff from the root cellar floor, and he had the hollow eyes of someone who'd spent the night not sleeping, which gave him and the Calloways something in common. He came out blinking and stood in the thin winter light while Thorne closed the cellar door, and Marlowe looked at him and tried to assess what she was actually dealing with. He wasn't defiant. That was the main thing. The night in the cellar seemed to have completed some internal process that her words in the snow had begun, and what was left was a young man who looked like he'd made a calculation and arrived at a conclusion he wasn't happy about but had accepted. You're going to the sheriff, he said. It wasn't a question. We're all going to the sheriff, Marlowe said. Together. He looked at the charred doorframe of the forge, visible from where they stood. He looked at Thorne's wrapped arm. He looked at the snow around the forge entrance, still disturbed in places beneath the fresh overnight accumulation. You could see the shapes of where things had happened if you knew what you were looking for. Riley got away, Cyrus said. We know. He'll have gone back to Cutter by now. Yes, Marlowe said, which is why we're not standing here any longer. She looked at him steadily. You're not in danger walking through town with us, Cyrus. You're in considerably more danger if you somehow end up alone before you give that statement. Do you understand what I'm saying? He understood. She could see it in his face. The realization that the man who'd hired him had considerably more to lose than Cyrus Webb did, and that men with considerably more to lose had options available to them that didn't require moral consideration. He pulled his coat tighter and nodded. They walked to the sheriff's office. Main Street in the aftermath of a blizzard had a particular quality, muffled and slow. The town emerging incrementally, people digging out their storefronts and walkways, horses standing steam-breathed at hitching posts. The cold was still serious, but the light had the clean quality that follows heavy snowfall, clear and flat and honest. People saw them. That was partly the point. 3 people walking together down the middle of Main Street in the snow the morning after a blizzard drew attention, and Marlowe let it draw attention. She walked at her usual pace, unhurried, upright, not looking around her but aware of every set of eyes that found them and followed. She wanted the walk witnessed. She wanted the town to know, before any other version of the night's events could circulate, that something had happened and the Calloways were walking toward accountability rather than away from it. Ed Dolan was sweeping snow off his front step when they passed. He stopped sweeping and watched them, his broom held still. Addie Marsh's curtain moved in her window. 2 men outside the saloon, it wasn't open yet, they were just standing, tracked the 3 of them the length of the street with their eyes. Sheriff Dale Purvis's office was on the corner of Main and Creek Road. The light was on inside, which meant he was already in. Marlowe pushed the door open without knocking. Purvis looked up from behind his desk. He was a heavy-set man in his early 50s, with a gray mustache and the air of someone who'd gotten comfortable in a position over a long time. He looked at Thorne. He looked at Marlowe. He looked at Cyrus Webb, and something shifted in his expression. Mrs. Calloway, he said. Thorne. He looked at the wrapped arm. What happened? 4 men came to our property last night, Marlowe said. She didn't sit down. Neither did Thorne. Cyrus stood just inside the closed door. They set fire to the forge entrance and attacked my husband. We have one of them here? She indicated Cyrus. He has a statement to make. I'd like you to write it down. Purvis looked at Cyrus Webb for a long moment. Son, you want to tell me your name? Cyrus Webb, from Cutter's Bend originally. And you were at the Calloway property last night? Yes, sir. A pause. Purvis's eyes moved to Marlowe and then back. You were there doing what, exactly? Cyrus looked at Marlowe. She gave him nothing. No encouragement, no warning, just waited. This was his moment, and it needed to be his. She couldn't give it to him or take it from him. He looked back at the sheriff. We were sent to burn the forge, he said, and to make sure the Calloways couldn't interfere with it. The room was quiet enough that the stove in the corner sounded loud. Sent by who? Purvis said. His voice had changed quality slightly. Riley Marsh organized it, but the order came from Silas Cutter. Mr. Cutter wants the Calloway land for the water rights on the creek branch. He'd been trying to buy it and they wouldn't sell, so he... Cyrus stopped. He swallowed. He said to make the property worthless. Burn the forge, hurt the blacksmith bad enough he couldn't work. Then come back to him with a lower offer when there was nothing left to protect. Purvis sat back in his chair. He looked at the wall for a moment, which Marlowe suspected was him looking at his hunting arrangement with Cutter and running some unpleasant arithmetic. That's a serious accusation, he said. It's a statement of fact, Marlowe said, and we have supporting evidence. She reached into her coat and produced the folded letter from the ledger, the anonymous threat that had been slid under the forge door. She set it on his desk. That arrived 3 weeks ago. No signature, but the timing and content connect directly to Cutter's interest in the property, which Cyrus has just confirmed. We also have 2 previous refusals of Cutter's purchase offer on record, which establishes the motive and the pattern. She looked at Purvis steadily. I'd like to know what you're going to do about it, Sheriff. Purvis looked at the letter. He looked at Thorne. How bad's the arm? It'll work, Thorne said. The forge? Door frame and some scorching on the front wall. It could have been worse. Purvis was quiet for a long moment. He was doing something internal that Marlowe couldn't fully read, but she thought it was the process of a man who'd been carefully comfortable for a long time being forced to decide, on short notice, what he actually was. Riley Marsh, he said finally. You said he ran. He fled the scene, Marlowe said. He'll have been at the Broken Horn by midnight. Cutter won't give him up. Cutter won't have a choice if you go out there with a deputy and a warrant. She leaned forward slightly. Dale, you know what happened last night. You know what this letter is. You know what Cyrus just told you, and he's sitting right there, and you can take his statement in writing and have him sign it. She kept her voice level and factual, not heated. Silas Cutter tried to burn my house down with us in it and paid men to beat my husband unconscious if they could manage it. The fact that he has large acreage and a hunting arrangement with you does not change what he did. The silence that followed was long enough to be uncomfortable. Then Purvis opened his desk drawer and took out paper. Sit down, Mr. Webb, he said. I'm going to need the full account. They were in the sheriff's office for 2 hours. Purvis took Cyrus Webb's statement with a thoroughness that surprised Marlowe slightly. She'd expected him to do the minimum, and she'd been prepared to push for more. But something in the man had apparently resolved itself, because he went through the account carefully and asked precise questions and wrote it all down in a slow, methodical hand and had Cyrus sign each page. He also took a statement from Thorne and a statement from Marlowe, asking her specifically about the threat letter and its timing relative to Cutter's second purchase offer, which she answered with dates and details from the ledger she'd brought. When it was done, Purvis read back through the statements. He set them down and looked at the wall again, and then he looked at Thorne. I want you to know, Purvis said, that I've been... He stopped. Started again. I should have paid closer attention to this situation some months back. When you turned down his offer the second time, I heard about it and He rubbed the back of his neck. I thought it would resolve itself. It almost resolved itself over my forge last night, Thorne said. Not angrily, just factually. Purvis nodded. He looked like a man accepting a weight that was fairly placed on him. I'm going to ride to the Broken Horn this afternoon. I'll take my deputy. If Marsh is there, I'll bring him in. And if Marsh is there and confirms what Webb has said, he looked at the statement pages. Then I go back for Cutter. If Marsh isn't there anymore, Marlowe asked, then I start looking for him. Purvis looked at her. Mrs. Calloway, I want to be straight with you. Cutter is going to claim he knows nothing about this. He's going to say Marsh acted independently, or that Marsh doesn't even work for him in any official capacity. That's how men like him operate. I know, she said, but Marsh will have to convince 12 people of that in a courtroom, and Cyrus Webb's signed statement will be sitting in front of them, and so will that letter, and so will the evidence on the Forge property. She held his gaze. Whatever Cutter claims, the story has a shape now. It had no shape before because no one was looking at it all together. Now it does. Purvis stood up and took his coat from the hook by the door. I'll ride out this afternoon, he said again. I'll send word before evening. Word came at 4 o'clock, delivered by Purvis's deputy, a young man named Cal, who looked barely old enough to shave but had serious eyes. He found the Calloways at the Forge, where Thorne had been assessing the damage in the daylight, and Marlowe had been doing the same from a practical standpoint, measuring the burnt sections, calculating material, making notes. Sheriff got to the Broken Horn, Cal said. Riley Marsh was still there. Hadn't left yet. Roads were still too bad, I guess, where he figured Cutter could insulate him. A beat. He couldn't. Marlowe looked up from her notes. Marsh gave a statement? Thorne said. Marsh gave everything, Cal said, with the barely concealed astonishment of someone who'd witnessed a chain of events go faster and more completely than expected. Soon as the sheriff told him what Cyrus Webb had signed, he just folded. Told the sheriff the whole thing, who organized it, who approved it, what the instructions were. Named 2 of the other men from last night by name. Cal looked at them both. Sheriff placed Mr. Cutter under arrest at the Broken Horn at 2:30. He's in the jail right now. The silence after that was different from other silences. It had a weight to it, but the weight was the weight of something falling into place rather than bearing down. 2 of the others are named, Marlowe said, from last night. Yes, ma'am, they'll be picked up. The sheriff figures the 4th, the one who knocked Mr. Calloway's arm, is the same man Webb described as having worked for Cutter Seasonal before. He knows who to look for. Thorne was quiet for a moment. He was looking at the charred door frame, at the scorched stones around the forge entrance, at all of it in the clear, cold afternoon light. Thank you, Cal, Marlowe said. The deputy nodded and rode back toward the north end of town, and they stood there alone for a moment in front of their damaged forge, with the news settling around them. It's not finished, Thorne said. There'll be lawyers. Cutter has money for lawyers. Yes, she agreed. It won't be fast, and it won't be clean. She looked at the forge. But he's in a jail cell tonight, instead of sitting in that big house deciding what to do to us next. That's what's different today from yesterday. Thorne turned to look at her. His arm was in a cloth sling she'd fashioned that morning, and there was a bruise coming up along his jaw that hadn't been visible in the lamplight, and he looked tired in the deep way of someone who'd spent everything they had and was now trying to work out what was left. But he was standing, and he was looking at her with the expression she still didn't have one name for, the one that was in the neighborhood of gratitude but bigger than that, and more permanent. You saved my life last night, he said. She didn't look away from him. You would have done the same. I know. That's not the point. He reached out with his good hand and put it against the side of her face, and she felt the roughness of it, the heat and the calluses, and the decades of forge work in every ridge of his palm. I need you to know that I know that. What you did. Who you are. Her throat tightened slightly, not from sadness, something closer to the feeling of being seen completely, which was a thing she'd wanted for so long that receiving it still caught her off guard. I know, she said quietly. He kept his hand against her face for a moment longer. Then he dropped it and looked back at the forge. We should figure out the repairs. I've already started the list, she said. It's not as bad as it looked last night. It's going to need a new door frame. The stone around the entrance needs raking out and resetting. Front wall section needs... All of that's in the notes. She showed him the paper. He looked at the notes. His brow creased slightly, not with concern, but with the particular focus of a man looking at a problem and already solving it. I can get the frame material from the lumber yard. Roper owes me for work I did in the spring. I let it sit because he was short, but he's back on his feet now. I'll call it in. I'll write Roper today, she said. I can write my own. You're right-handed and your left arm is in a sling, Thorne. Let me write Roper. He paused. Then, fine. She made a small note on the paper. The front wall stone is actually the harder problem. Do we know a mason? There's a man in Hatchfield, Ben Sorrells. He did the chimney on the Marsh House 3 years ago. I'll find his address. Marlowe. He said her name in that particular way again. What? Stop doing the list for 1 minute. She looked up. He was looking at her with something approaching exasperation and something approaching affection in a combination that was, she'd found, extremely characteristic of him. We're allowed to just stand here for a minute, without the list. She looked at him. She looked at the damaged forge. She looked at the white landscape around them, the snow covering the tracks of last night, the clean, cold sky above the ridge. She put the paper in her pocket. 1 minute, she said. 1 minute, he agreed. They stood there together in the cold, and it wasn't comfortable exactly. It was too cold for comfort, and his arm hurt and her hand hurt, and neither of them had slept, and there was a list a mile long waiting in her pocket. But it was something better than comfortable. It was solid. It was two people standing on their own ground and knowing it was still theirs. The news of Silas Cutter's arrest moved through Dry Creek Ridge faster than the blizzard had. By evening, the broad shape of what had happened was known in every home on every street, though the details varied considerably depending on who was telling it. What was consistent, what nobody disputed, because too many people had seen the walk to the sheriff's office that morning, was that the Calloways had gone straight to Purvis, evidence in hand, and that within the same day the most powerful man in the valley was sitting in a jail cell. The reactions were varied and complex and not uniformly positive, because these things never are. Cutter had been a significant economic force in the region for 30 years, and there were people whose livelihoods were tied to the broken horn in ways that made the news threatening rather than reassuring. A few of those people were quiet and watchful in the days that followed, but there were others, the 40 families with water rights downstream of the creek branch, the farmers and small ranchers who'd been navigating Cutter's slow consolidation of water access for years without being able to name or confront it. And for those people, the arrest was something they'd stopped believing was possible. The relief in some of those faces, when Marlowe encountered them in the days after, was a real and complicated thing to witness. Hector Grimes was visible in town the day after the arrest, and then noticeably less visible the day after that, and then largely absent for the next 2 weeks. His connection to Cutter, the message running, the errand work, was known to enough people now that the position he'd built for himself as the town's dominant voice had become uncomfortable to occupy. Marlowe didn't seek him out. She didn't need to. Time was doing something to Hector Grimes's standing that no confrontation she could manufacture would have accomplished as cleanly. Dell Grimes, remarkably, came to the forge on a Tuesday morning 8 days after the arrest. She came alone, without Ruth Baxter or Connie Flett for company, and she stood at the entrance, the new temporary door frame Thorne had put up while waiting for Roper's lumber, and she asked if Marlowe was available. Marlowe came to the door and looked at her. Dell Grimes looked like she'd prepared what she was going to say and was now finding it harder than she'd expected. She was holding her hands in front of her in a way that suggested she didn't know what else to do with them. "I heard what happened," Dell said. "The night of the blizzard." "Most of the town has heard," Marlowe said. She kept her voice neutral. She wasn't going to make this easier, but she wasn't going to make it brutal either. The woman was standing at her door attempting something that clearly cost her. "I wanted to..." Dell stopped. "What you did. For your husband." She looked at Marlowe directly for the first time in the conversation. "I don't think most women would have done that. I don't think I would have." Marlowe was quiet for a moment. "You don't know what you do until you're in it," she said. "I didn't know either, until I was." Dell nodded slowly. She seemed to be searching for more words and finding the shelf less stocked than she'd hoped. "I've said some unkind things." "Yes," Marlowe said. "You have. I'm not going to pretend I was just having a bad day or that I didn't mean them." I wouldn't believe it if you did. Dell looked at her with something that might have been respect and might have been discomfort, both wearing the same expression. No, she said. I suppose you wouldn't. She pulled her coat tighter. I thought you should know that I've been thinking about it, about what I said and why I said it, and what that says about me. She paused. I don't think I've given much thought to that last part before. What things I do say about me. Marlowe looked at her for a long moment. Dell Grimes was not a person she would have chosen as a friend or would choose now. The cruelty in that store had been real, and the pleasure Dell had taken in it had been real. And those things didn't evaporate because the woman was now standing on her doorstep being honest. But honesty had its own weight, and Marlowe had always recognized it, even when she didn't like the person offering it. I appreciate you coming, she said. That took something. Dell nodded. She turned to go, then she stopped. Your business, she said without turning back around. What you've done with it. People are talking about it differently than they were. I thought you should know that too. She walked back up the side road without waiting for a response. Marlowe stood in the doorway of her forge for a moment in the cold. Then she went back inside. Carver Doyle came 2 days after Dell Grimes, but for different reasons. He had a broken gate latch and he needed it repaired. He handed the latch to Thorne and named a price that was, for the first time, within reasonable distance of correct. Thorne quoted him the actual correct price, which was slightly higher. Doyle opened his mouth. Then he closed it. Fine, he said. Thorne took the latch. Doyle looked around the forge, at the repaired entrance, at the new frame, at the evidence of the attack still visible in the scorched stone around the front wall that was waiting on Ben Sorrells, the mason. Heard about the blizzard, Doyle said. Thorne didn't respond. 4 of them, Doyle said, and your arm. And my wife, Thorne said. Doyle was quiet. He looked at the floor of the forge for a moment. He was not, Marlowe knew from observation, a man given to self-examination, but something was happening in his face that looked like the early stages of it. Cutter's been a problem for a long time, Doyle said finally, for a lot of people. Most of us just didn't see the point of being the one to stand up about it. I know, Thorne said. Your wife saw it different. She sees most things different than the people who've been here a long time, Thorne said. I think that's because she came in without already knowing how things were supposed to work. He looked at Doyle. Sometimes that's what it takes. Someone who doesn't know they're supposed to find it manageable. Doyle sat with that for a moment. Then he took his hat off and put it back on, which was apparently a way of managing his hands when he didn't know what else to say. Latch will be ready Tuesday, Thorne said. Right. Doyle turned to leave. Calloway. He said the name without turning around. You've got a good woman there. I know that, Thorne said. Doyle left. Thorne went back to work. Marlowe, who had been in the small connecting room where she kept the ledger and heard all of it through the open doorway, said nothing. She wrote the Doyle transaction into the ledger at the full correct rate and underlined it once, neatly, and went back to the accounts. The legal proceedings against Silas Cutter began in January, and they were, as Marlowe had predicted, neither fast nor clean. Cutter had 3 lawyers from Denver who arrived on the first decent stagecoach after the blizzard season eased, and they were expensive lawyers who were good at their work, and the proceedings were going to take time. But time, it turned out, was something that worked more in the Calloway's favor than against them, because every week that passed with Cyrus Webb's signed statement in the court record, and Riley Marsh's testimony confirmed, and the physical evidence on the forge property documented, was another week that the story's shape remained clear and consistent, and Cutter's lawyers couldn't change the shape. They could only try to argue around it. The water rights question, which had seemed like a legal abstraction when Thorne first explained it to Marlowe, became the central feature of the town's conversation that winter. People who hadn't understood what those rights meant began to understand, because Marlowe explained it, at the post office, at Dolan's store, in the conversation she had around town, in language that was plain and specific. 40 families downstream, a third of the valley's water access. Control that, and you control who farms and who doesn't. People listened. They listened partly because the Calloways had earned a different kind of attention from the town by then, not the gawking attention of people watching a spectacle, but the attention of people who'd seen something they hadn't expected and were still thinking about it. And they listened partly because Marlowe had a way of explaining things that didn't make people feel stupid for not having understood before. She wasn't condescending, she was just clear. "You're changing this town," Addie Marsh told her one afternoon, sitting in the Calloway kitchen with tea going because Addie had developed the habit of stopping in on Tuesday afternoons. "I'm not changing it," Marlowe said. "I'm just having conversations. Conversations that make people think about things they've been not thinking about." Addie looked at her over her mug. "That's how change works, Marlowe. It's not speeches, it's conversations." Marlowe thought about that. "I don't have any ambitions beyond my household and my business," she said honestly. "I just don't see why the people in this valley should have their water held over them." "Nobody does anything unless they see why it matters to them personally," Addie said. "You made it personal. That's the skill." Thorne came in while they were talking, smelling of coal smoke and iron, and poured himself coffee without interrupting. He sat down at the end of the table. His arm was out of the sling now. The wrist still carried some stiffness in cold weather, but he was working again at close to full capacity, which was what mattered. He listened to the conversation without participating in it, which was his usual mode when Addie was there. He told Marlowe once early on that he'd lost the habit of conversation during the years of being alone, and he was only now, slowly, remembering that it didn't have to cost something. She understood that. She let him find the speed that was natural. "People are going to need the forge more as spring comes," Addie said. "All the equipment that sat all winter, hinges, latches, wheel fittings, you're going to be busy." "We're going to be busy," Marlowe corrected. Addie smiled at that. Then she looked between Marlowe and Thorne, and whatever she saw in the particular arrangement of two people sharing a kitchen, in the way that only people who've been through something together can share a space, she seemed satisfied with it. She finished her tea and got her coat and left them to their evening. Ed Dolan stopped Marlowe outside his store the second week of February. She'd been on her way to the postal office, the weekly correspondence with suppliers in her hand, and he came out his front door fast enough that she thought something was wrong. But his face wasn't alarmed. It was something more complicated than that. He was holding his broom the same way he'd been holding it the morning of the walk to the sheriff's office, clutched at the middle, and he had the look of a man who'd been preparing something and wasn't sure the preparation had been sufficient. "Mrs. Calloway," he said, "there's something I've been meaning to say." She waited. "The day you arrived," he said, "that first day when Hector Grimes was—" He stopped and started again. "I was standing right there at my counter, and I didn't say anything. I heard it, and I just stayed behind my counter." He looked at her directly, which she could tell was an effort for him. "And then, in my store that day with Dell, I pretended to be interested in the register." He pressed his mouth together. "I'm not proud of either of those things." Marlowe looked at him. He was maybe 60, with kind eyes and the permanent slight stoop of a man who'd spent decades behind a counter. "You were afraid of Hector," she said. "That's part of it. It's not all of it." He shook his head. "Part of it was just, it was easier not to. And I knew it was easier, and I did it anyway." He looked at her. "I want you to know I know that." She thought about what to say. She thought about Thorne, 7 years alone in this town, and the number of people like Ed Dolan who'd been standing right there. "I appreciate you saying it," she said finally. And she meant it. Not the absolution he might have been hoping for, but the appreciation for the honesty, which was real. "It takes something to say it." He nodded. He seemed not entirely sure if he'd done enough or said it right, which was probably appropriate. Some things didn't resolve cleanly, and it wasn't honest to pretend they did. She continued to the postal office. On the way back, she passed the forge, and she could hear Thorne working inside. The rhythm of the hammer, precise and purposeful, the sound of the bellows, the hiss of metal in the quench. The sounds she'd first heard from the doorway a year ago and found herself drawn to without fully understanding why. She stopped for a moment on the side road and listened. She thought about the 12-year-old girl who'd been teased at a church social in a town she'd grown up in, and the 17-year-old who'd learned to make herself invisible, and the 23-year-old who'd tried to be agreeable and small and found that it purchased exactly nothing. She thought about the letter with the pressed hard handwriting and the crossed-out sentence she'd never been able to read, and the 9 days on bad roads, And the moment she'd stepped off the stagecoach onto Main Street and felt every eye swing toward her, she thought about the sledgehammer, not the drama of it, not the story it had become, the actual physical reality of it, her hands on the handle, her weight going forward, the impact and the result. The simple arithmetic of deciding to move towards something instead of away from it. That was the only thing she'd actually done. Move toward instead of away, at every junction where those were the available choices. It had worked. Imperfectly, messily, with consequences she was still managing and a blister on her palm, and a husband with a stiff wrist, and a charred doorframe waiting on a mason from Hatchfield. But it had worked. She listened to the hammer fall, once, twice, 3 times, each strike exactly where it needed to be. Then she went inside to write Roper about the next lumber delivery, because the forge wasn't going to repair itself, and there was a business to run, and spring was coming, and she had a great deal of work still to do. Spring came to Dry Creek Ridge the way it always does at altitude, reluctantly, in stages, with several convincing false starts that tricked the optimistic into putting away their heavy coats before it was genuinely safe to do so. The first real sign of it wasn't the temperature, it was the sound. The creek branch on the eastern edge of the Calloway property, which had been locked silent under ice since December, started talking again in the second week of March, a low, continuous murmur that Marlowe could hear from the bedroom window if she woke early enough, which she usually did. She'd started listening for it deliberately, this particular sound, because of what it meant beyond just the season. That water running freely over its own bed, belonging to no one and controlled by no one, was a sound with a legal dimension now. It was the sound of something that had nearly been taken and wasn't. Silas Cutter's trial had concluded in late February. It hadn't gone the way Cutter's Denver lawyers had planned, which was to say it had gone toward accountability rather than away from it, though not without significant effort on both sides. Riley Marsh's testimony had been the linchpin. Marsh, facing the longer sentence as the organizer of the actual attack, had decided that complete cooperation was his best available option, and complete cooperation was what he'd provided. He'd named Cutter's instructions specifically, including a conversation he'd had with Cutter 3 days before the blizzard, in which Cutter had been, as Marsh put it to the court, very clear about what he wanted the outcome to be. Cutter's lawyers had spent considerable energy attacking Marsh's credibility, which was fair since Marsh's credibility was genuinely attackable. But Cyrus Webb's statement corroborated the core of it, and the letter under the door, unsigned, unprovable as Cutter's directly, but sitting in context with everything else, gave the jury something to look at while they decided what they believed. They believed enough. Silas Cutter was convicted of conspiracy to commit arson and conspiracy to commit assault. He was not convicted on the stronger charges the prosecutor had attempted, which the prosecutor had half expected and the Calloways had been prepared for. The law moved imperfectly, it always had. But it moved. He was sentenced to 4 years and assessed a fine that was significant even by his standards. The water rights on the creek branch were examined in a separate civil proceeding and confirmed as belonging exclusively to the Calloway property, with the downstream access arrangements protected under the existing watershed agreements that Cutter had been slowly working to erode for years. That protection was now formalized and recorded in a way that couldn't be quietly undone. Marlowe had been present in the courthouse for the verdict. She'd sat in the gallery with her hands folded in her lap and her face composed, and when the verdict was read, she hadn't cheered or cried or visibly reacted at all, which had confused the few people watching her for a reaction. What she'd actually felt was something more complicated than relief or triumph. It was a kind of exhausted rightness, the feeling of something returning to where it should have been all along. Not a win, exactly. More like a correction. Thorne had been beside her, his shoulder solid against hers. When it was over, he'd put his hand over hers briefly on the way out and said nothing, which was exactly what she'd needed. They'd walked home in the February cold, and she'd made soup from what was in the larder, and they'd eaten it at their table in their house on their property, and that had been enough. Ben Sorrells the mason arrived from Hatchfield in the first genuinely warm week of March, a compact man in his 60s with large hands and a practiced eye that moved over the scorched stonework at the forge entrance without expression for a long moment before he said anything. "Stones sound underneath," he said. Fire didn't get into the structure. You're looking at resetting the facing on this section here and repointing everything within about 6 feet of the damage. New lintel stone. This one's cracked through. See here." He showed Thorne with his finger where the crack ran. 2 days' work, maybe 3 if the weather turns. "What's your rate?" Marlowe asked. Sorrells told her. It was fair. Deliberately fair, she thought, not undercut, but not inflated either. The work of a man who valued his time accurately without trying to extract from the situation. "Deal," she said. "When can you start?" "I'm here now," he said simply. She liked him. He worked for 3 days, and in that time said approximately 40 words that weren't related to the job, which was a conversational style she respected. He reset the stone facing, repointed the joints in a careful expanding ring around the repair, fitted the new lintel with a precision that Thorne watched with visible professional appreciation, and on the morning of the 3rd day came to the kitchen door to say he was done. Marlowe paid him. She added a small amount above the agreed rate, which he looked at for a moment. "Work came out well," she said. He nodded. He put the money in his coat. He hitched his cart and drove back toward Hatchfield without ceremony, and the forge entrance stood behind him repaired and solid. And if you didn't know what you were looking for, you'd never know anything had happened there. Thorne stood at the repaired entrance for a long moment after Sorrells left. "Better than before," he said finally. "A little," she agreed. "The original lintel had a seam in the wrong place. I noticed it the first week. Sorrells did too. He used a single piece." Thorne looked at her. "You noticed a lintel seam in the first week." "I notice structural things," she said. "I always have." He shook his head slowly, not in disbelief, but in the kind of ongoing orientation that comes from continually finding out new things about a person. "What else have you noticed and not said anything about?" She considered. "The rear foundation has a soft corner that'll need addressing before next winter. The north wall of the house wants rechinking in 2 places. And your anvil stand is 2 inches lower on the right side than the left, which is why your shoulder gives you trouble after long sessions, because you're compensating without knowing it." He stared at her. "I was going to bring it up when the timing was better," she said. He looked at his anvil stand. He looked back at her. "How long have you known about the anvil stand?" "Since November." He made a sound somewhere between a laugh and a groan. "Marlowe." There was rather a lot happening in November, she pointed out. He went inside to look at his anvil stand, muttering something she chose not to fully hear. The community gathering happened on the 2nd Saturday of April, and it was not, to be clear, anything Marlowe or Thorne had organized or asked for. It had started, as best she could reconstruct it later, with a conversation between Addie Marsh and Ed Dolan sometime in early March, the details of which she was never entirely clear on. What she knew was that on a Tuesday afternoon, Addie had stopped in for tea as usual and mentioned, with the casual tone of someone conveying a weather update, that a number of people in town were thinking about coming to help repair the forge properly before spring work got fully underway. "Who is a number of people?" Marlowe said. "Oh, various," Addie said pleasantly. "Ed mentioned it to the Harker boys, and they mentioned it to the Cassidy family, and it went from there. You know how these things go?" "I don't, actually," Marlowe said. "This hasn't happened to me before." Addie looked at her over her mug. "Maybe it hasn't happened to you because you've never been somewhere long enough or safe enough for it to." She set the mug down. "Let people do this, Marlowe. It matters to them, not just to you." She thought about that for a day. Then she told Thorne. He was quiet for longer than usual. "People from this town," he said. "Apparently." He was quiet again. She let it stay quiet because she understood that for Thorne Calloway, the concept of neighbors, the actual town of people who had mostly feared him or ignored him for 7 years, coming voluntarily to help him was something that needed time to become a reality rather than an idea. "All right," he said finally. "All right," she agreed. "What?" They came on a Saturday morning, and there were more of them than Marlowe had anticipated. The Harker boys arrived first, 3 of them, all broad and practical, with tools already in hand. Ed Dolan came with lumber he'd been holding since March, waiting for the date to be set. The widow Cassidy sent her 2 sons, who were strong and willing if not especially skilled. Ben Sorrells had apparently told someone in Hatchfield, because two men arrived from that direction whom nobody in Dry Creek Ridge knew by name, but who clearly knew what they were doing around stone and mortar. Addie Marsh was there. She did not do physical work, but she had brought a pot of something that smelled like the best thing Marlowe had encountered in months, and she managed the food situation with the efficiency of a field general, which freed Marlowe to do everything else. Carver Doyle showed up, which surprised her. He didn't make a speech about it. He just tied his horse at the post and asked the nearest Harker boy what needed doing and did it. That was the version of changed behavior she found most credible, the kind that didn't announce itself. Ruth Baxter and Connie Flett came in the afternoon together with a basket of food contributions. They didn't approach Marlowe directly at first. They found useful things to do, passing materials, keeping water coming for the workers. And eventually Ruth caught Marlowe's eye across the work site and gave a short nod that wasn't quite an apology but was something in the same county. Marlowe nodded back. She didn't push for more than that. This was how things actually changed in real communities, not in grand gestures but in accumulated small ones, people adjusting their behavior in ways that acknowledged something without requiring either party to formally process it. It was imperfect. It was human. Even Dale Purvis came by in the afternoon, not in an official capacity, just as a man with a free Saturday and apparently a conscience that had been working overtime since February. He worked for 2 hours without talking much and left without ceremony, and Thorne watched him go without saying anything, which was its own kind of statement. The work itself was genuine. The forge was re-roofed in sections that had been weakened before anyone knew they were weakened. The exterior wall was redone properly, not just patched. Someone, she never determined who, replaced the rotting boards on the back of the house that she'd noted in her inventory months ago and hadn't yet gotten to. The anvil stand, because Thorne had apparently mentioned it to the Harker boys, was leveled with a precision that made him stand there looking at it for a full minute before he said anything. "How did they know about the stand?" she asked him later. "I may have said something to Ed about it," he said, "about the stand I mentioned to you in November." "I'm getting to things," he said. "I just needed some help." She looked at him. He was not a man who said I needed some help easily, and they both knew it. And the fact that he'd said it now and was looking at her steadily while he did was its own kind of thing. "You're allowed to need help," she said. "I know that," he said. "I'm still getting used to it." By evening, the forge was better than it had been since Thorne built it. Not perfect. Nothing built by many hands in a day achieves perfection. And there were joints that would need revisiting and one section of roof she'd be watching through the next rain season, but solid and right and substantially improved. And the people who'd built it were still there at sundown, eating Addie's food and talking in the easy way of people who've done physical work together and found it made them more comfortable with each other than they'd been before. Thorne stood at the edge of it and looked at his forge and then at the people around it, and she watched him do it from across the yard. She'd seen his face in enough different lights by now that she could read it with some accuracy. She saw the thing it cost him to accept this, not the work, not the repairs, but the people. The people who'd been afraid of him, or dismissive of him, or simply absent when absence was cruel, and who were now standing in his yard eating soup and talking to each other, and to him like he was a man among men rather than a problem to be managed. That cost him something. Not because he was ungrateful, because it made real, in a way he'd been protecting himself from for 7 years, what it would have meant to have had it all along. She went and stood beside him. "You all right?" she asked quietly, under the noise of the crowd. "Working on it," he said. His voice was rough in a way that wasn't injury. She didn't say anything else. She just stood beside him and let the evening happen around them. The light going golden and then copper over the ridge. The sounds of people talking. The smell of food and sawdust and fresh-cut wood, and the sound of the creek branch below them running clear in the new warmth. After a while, he put his arm around her, and she leaned into his side, and they stood there together while their town came into being around them. The summer that followed was the busiest the Callaway Forge had ever seen. It was partly practical. Winter always produced a backlog of broken and worn equipment that needed attention come spring, and this year's winter had been hard enough to produce more than usual. But it was also something else. The town's relationship to the forge had shifted, and in shifting, it had brought the forge more work than it would otherwise have seen. People who'd been driving to Cutter's Bend for their ironwork because the Callaway Forge had seemed somehow too fraught with social complexity, with Thorne's face and the town's uneasiness around it, started bringing their work to the forge on the side road, and most of them, showing up for the first time or the first time in years, found it a perfectly ordinary and excellent blacksmith operation run by a man who did exceptional work and a woman who knew exactly what it was worth. Marlowe hired a boy named Tom Greer in June. He was 16, quick-minded, and living with his aunt after his parents had both died of fever 2 winters back. She'd found him sweeping outside the postal office for whatever coin the postmaster could spare, and she'd watched him work for 10 minutes. Not the sweeping, but the way he watched everything around him, the way his eyes tracked and his hands looked for something useful to do. And she'd offered him a trial month at the forge doing the accounts cleaning and supply organization. He'd said yes before she finished the sentence. He was good. Not at the accounts yet. That would take teaching, and she was in the process of teaching him, but at the underlying quality that made someone good with accounts, which was the inability to leave imprecision alone. He found errors without being asked to look for them. He organized things according to a logic that, when she examined it, usually made more sense than the previous arrangement. He was also, quietly and without drama, attentive to Thorne in the way that young men sometimes are with older men who have a skill they respect, hovering at the entrance of the forge, at moments he thought were allowed, watching the work with that same hungry attention she'd brought to the same doorway 18 months ago. Thorne noticed. He didn't say anything about it to Marlowe directly, but she saw the way he started explaining things while he worked, small technical details delivered to the air in front of him that were clearly intended for the boy hovering at the entrance. She saw the afternoon he handed Tom a piece of scrap iron and a hammer and said, without preamble, "See if you can get that edge true," and then watched with his arms crossed while the boy tried. She wrote in the ledger and pretended not to notice any of it, because some things were better witnessed quietly than commented on. Hector Grimes left Dry Creek Ridge in July. She heard about it secondhand, from Addie, who heard it from Ed, who'd heard it from the man who'd bought Hector's horse because Hector needed traveling money. He and Dell had gone to his brother's place in New Mexico, apparently, though the details were vague in the way that details are vague when a departure is more flight than choice. She thought about Dell Grimes standing at her door in the February cold saying, "I've been thinking about what things I do say about me." She wondered if that thinking had produced anything livable for Dell, or if it had only made the existing situation more uncomfortable without providing a direction out. She hoped, without sentimentality, that Dell had found something better. She didn't know. Some stories you don't get to follow to the end. Cyrus Webb had done his 6 months of labor service and been released in May. He'd apparently not returned to Cutter's Bend. She'd heard through the indirect channels of small-town information that he was working at a horse ranch somewhere south of Hatchfield. She found she hoped things went well for him too, which was a more complicated feeling than it would have been in a simpler story, but the story wasn't simple, and she'd long since made her peace with that. On a Thursday evening in late August, a year and a half after she'd stepped off a stagecoach into a street full of strangers and someone's laughter, Marlowe sat at the kitchen table with the ledger open and did the quarterly accounting. The numbers were good. They were genuinely good in a way that still occasionally surprised her. Not because she doubted her own capability, but because she'd understood from the beginning that capability alone doesn't determine outcomes. Luck and timing and the decisions of other people all have their votes, and those votes don't always go the right way. This time, they had. She closed the ledger and sat back in her chair. Through the open window, she could hear Tom Greer in the forge, the sound of the bellows, which meant he'd stayed late again. This was becoming a habit. She'd started leaving a portion of supper for him without making a formal arrangement about it, and it disappeared without discussion, which was a system. She heard Thorne's boots on the porch. He came in and looked at the closed ledger, and looked at her face and understood something from what he saw there. "Good?" he asked. "Very good," she said. He sat down. He'd been working since early morning, and he had the satisfied tiredness of a man who'd done exactly the thing he was built to do for the right amount of time. His wrist still stiffened slightly in the heat at the forge. She'd noticed it, and so had he, and they'd stopped discussing it because there was nothing useful to say. But his hands were steady, and his eye was sharp, and his work was the same quality it had always been, which was exceptional. "Tom stayed late again," she said. I know, I gave him a second piece to work on. He's going to want to learn the forge properly. I know that too. She looked at him. Are you going to teach him? Thorn looked at his hands. He turned them over, looked at the palms, turned them back. I've been thinking about it, he said. I don't know how much I have to teach. What I know, I mostly learned from a man who never explained anything. You just watched and tried and got it wrong until you got it right. That's still teaching, she said. It's just teaching without the talking. He looked up at her. You think I should? I think, she said carefully, that you have a skill that took you 30 years to develop, and that there's a 16-year-old boy in your forge right now who would receive it with more care and seriousness than most men give anything. She held his gaze. And I think you know that. He was quiet for a moment. He'd have to earn it. Of course. I don't go easy on work. I know. He knows too. He'd rather have it hard and real than easy and not. Another beat of quiet. Then Thorn got up and went to the window that looked toward the forge and stood there looking at the light coming from it in the dusk. I'll talk to him, he said. She opened the ledger again and wrote a note in the margin. Not an account, just a note to herself, a date, and 2 words. Tom. Apprenticeship. She'd make it formal in the accounts when there was something formal to record. The thing Marlowe understood now, that she hadn't understood when she'd written a letter to a stranger who pressed too hard on the pen, was that courage isn't a condition. It's not something you have or don't have, the way you might have brown hair or a steady hand. It's a decision you make, over and over, at each junction where the available choices are toward and away. And you don't make it once and have it made. You make it again in the morning and again when someone says something cruel in a general store, and again in a blizzard with a sledgehammer in your hands, and again when a town you didn't grow up in and didn't choose shows up in your yard and you have to decide what to do with that. She'd gotten it wrong before, plenty of times. She'd chosen a way when she should have chosen toward, and spent years being smaller than she was because it seemed like the way to stop the hurt. It didn't stop the hurt. It just added a different kind, the kind that comes from abandoning yourself for the comfort of people who weren't even paying attention. She didn't have a tidy lesson to draw from that. Life didn't produce tidy lessons in her experience. What it produced was specific, accumulated knowledge, that a particular kind of person exists who will respect only what you actually are, never what you've reduced yourself to for their benefit. And the only way to find those people is to be what you actually are, which is frightening because it makes rejection certain and absolute. When you're small, rejection is partial. Maybe they'd like you if you were different. When you're yourself, the verdict is final. Thorn had been the first person in her life who'd made her feel like the verdict was favorable. She thought about that sometimes, about how much of her courage in Dry Creek Ridge was hers, and how much had been built on that first foundation. She couldn't fully separate the two, and she'd stopped trying. The honest answer was both, and each made the other possible. On the last day of August, she walked the eastern edge of the property. She did this sometimes, not for any practical reason, but because she liked to be outside in the mornings, and because the creek branch that ran along the eastern line was a pleasant thing to walk beside when the season was right. The water was lower now than in spring, quieter, running clean and easy over its stones. She stood at the edge of it for a while and looked at the water. 40 families downstream, a third of the valley's water. Those numbers had a face on them now. The Harker boys and old widow Cassidy, and the 2 men from Hatchfield whose names she'd finally learned, and the dozen other people who'd stood in the Calloway yard in April, working and eating and being, together, something different from what they'd been before. They were still those people. They still had their complications, and their histories, and their capacity to disappoint. But they were also now something connected. She heard Thorn coming along the creek path behind her and didn't turn until he was beside her. He looked at the water. She looked at him, looking at it. I was thinking, she said. About? About what we build next. She looked back at the creek. Not the business. The business is good. I mean, what next? What's after getting your footing? He was quiet for a moment. I don't know that I've thought about after, he said. For a long time, I was just trying to hold what I had. I know. She turned to look at him. But that's not where we are anymore. He considered. The shop front, he said. You mentioned it before. Selling finished work directly. Yes. She'd been thinking about it more concretely lately. There's a space on Main Street that Addie says the Fosters have been trying to rent since spring. The right side of it gets good light in the afternoon. People walking past would see displayed work. You've looked at it. I walked past it several times. He made that not quite smile that had been the first sign 18 months ago that there was warmth in him that he didn't know how to display. It was easier now, that smile. It came faster and more often. That was one of the things she'd watched change in him, slowly, the way the creek changes its bed. Not dramatically, just continuously, finding its way into the available space. All right, he said, let's look at it. Not today. No? Today I'm just standing here, she said. I'm allowed to do that sometimes. He stood beside her. The water moved past them without any interest in their plans or their history or the things they'd been through to arrive at this particular morning on this particular creek bank. It just ran, the way it had been running before either of them existed, the way it would run after. That was fine. That was, in fact, the whole point, that some things just continued, and the work of people was to keep them free to do so. She didn't say any of that to Thorne. He would have found it slightly too abstract for a Tuesday morning, and she would have been right to anticipate that. She just stood beside him in the late summer warmth, with the water going past, and the forge behind them, and the town that had become, imperfectly and genuinely, something like theirs. After a while he reached over and took her hand. His was rough and warm and permanent, the way she'd come to understand him as permanent. Not because permanence was promised, it never was, but because he was the kind of man who decided a thing and then lived by the decision, and he'd decided her, and she'd decided him, on a day that the whole town had expected to end in disaster. The town had been wrong about a great many things. They walked back toward the forge together, and behind them the creek ran on, clear and unbothered, down through the valley to the 40 families below, to the fields and the animals and the ordinary, irreplaceable life of the place, carrying nothing but water and keeping nothing for itself, which is the only way a thing that belongs to everyone can work. Tom Greer was already at the forge when they got back. He had the bellows going and the coals climbing, and he looked up when they came around the corner with the alert readiness of someone who'd been waiting to be useful. Thorne looked at the boy. The boy looked back at him. Get an apron, Thorne said. I'm going to show you something. Tom Greer's face did something complicated and young, and then he controlled it and nodded and went to get an apron because some things you don't get to come apart about in front of the person giving them to you. Marlo went into the house. She opened the ledger. She wrote the date and the entry. T. Greer, formal apprenticeship begins. Then she put the pen down and sat there for a moment, listening to the sound of the bellows and the fire building in the forge, and a man beginning to teach a boy what he knew. Outside, the season was turning. The mornings were cooler now, the light different, lower, more golden, the particular quality of light that late summer carries when it knows what's coming but hasn't given up yet. In a few weeks, the ridge would start showing white at the top again, and the preparations would begin, and the year would complete itself the way years do. But right now it was warm, and the forge was running, and the books were balanced, and the creek was free, and that was enough. That was, in fact, everything.